For this video, I'm going to show you a sample write-up on paper 5 planning, and I'm going to use a recent paper 5 which is from May-June 2020, paper 52, to show you what is the expectation of CIE for the recent papers. So for this question, we know that the expectation here is the students wanted to determine the respiration rate of wood lice. So this is like the dependent variable at different temperature, which is kind of like the independent variable. So now we're going to continue reading the question. Question wanted student to test the hypothesis that for each 10 degrees increase in temperature, the volume of oxygen absorbed will be double. So here the dependent variable will be more detailed, and the independent variable also they mention about the expectation. So we know what is the independent variable and the dependent variable. At the same time, we're going to observe the experiment setup, and we can tell that this is a respirometer using a capillary tube with colored liquid. So we know that this one, the scale is used to measure the distance traveled. So theory, we should know that as oxygen is being used up during respiration, the pressure will be decreasing. Therefore, the distance will be moving to the left-hand side upwards as the pressure of the atmosphere will be greater. And next thing, we observe that there's actually wood lice used. So this will be something that we need to think of to see how we would want to standardize this. Carbon dioxide absorbent, what is the use of it and how are we going to standardize? And what's the use of this syringe and the tap? So these are the details that we can include in our planning. For part 1, the question is like the typical planning question where they would like you to identify the variable first. So the independent variable here will be the temperature, and the dependent variable will be the volume of oxygen taken up. Remember to include the measuring unit in the sense that are you recording a volume, a mass, or time, instead of just saying oxygen taken up, then it will not be qualified as a mark. Or if you know that the method of recording the volume of oxygen taken up is by recording the distance traveled by the liquid, which is also an accepted answer. So take note, dependent variable must be something that's measurable. So both of these answers will be accepted. And if you write rate of respiration, that is not qualified. And for the next question, we'll see that the question mentioned that the temperature range to prepare will be between 5 to 35. So we know that for independent variable, we need to prepare at least 5 sets. So we need to answer why the student chose this range and propose a suitable interval. So first thing, this range of temperature most likely will be the temperature where the enzymes are functioning, where this enzyme they were referring to will be the respiratory enzyme, and we wouldn't want to denature the enzyme. And what is a suitable interval? As we know that in independent variable, we need to prepare at least 5. So if starting from 5, to prepare 5 different temperature between 5 degrees to 35 degrees, I would gap a 5 degrees Celsius for each. So I'll get 7 temperature here. So if you omit the first one and the last temperature will be still accepted. For this planning question, the part 1 has already covered the independent variable, where students are expected to know the range of temperature to prepare, and the control experiment is also being mentioned. So the planning part, you can straight away start with standard variable. So number 1, we can say that after you have set up the independent variable, which is the temperature, using thermostatically controlled water bath, the mass or the volume of carbon dioxide absorbent, such as soda lime, you can mention, or KOH, needs to be the same. Number 2, you can mention that the mass of the wood lice. And the next thing here is, if there's nothing much to talk about standard variable, we could move on to the procedure. So procedure will be the steps of experiments that involve precautions and things to take note to make sure that your experiment is accurate and reliable. So here we will say that we will make sure the tubes are attached and it's airtight. And another important thing to note here is we make sure that the dye is placed at the end of the capillary tube. And before we actually start measuring the result, we make sure that the wood lice can equilibrate to the temperature. So we can actually mention that the whole experiment setup or the apparatus is placed into the water bath. So you can start off with one temperature, and subsequently you remember to mention that the same procedure or the steps need to be repeated for the other temperature. So after you place the apparatus into the water bath, you need to wait for the wood lice to equilibrate or to acclimatize to the temperature, and usually equilibration requires only about 1 to 2 minutes. You will realize that for this mark scheme, they are very specific, as they mention that when you're equilibrating, make sure the tap is open. So it means that you haven't really actually started measuring the distance traveled. So it's to ensure that you are going to start your experiment after the equilibration time with the tap closed. So now only we are looking at the dependent variable. How do we start? So before we start measuring, we must make sure that we close the tap and mark the initial position of the liquid. Then to show that the pressure is actually changing, we will actually record the distance traveled by the dye. For some situation, we can actually set the distance and record the time. Sometimes, if you're not very sure with the value to propose, you can just mention within a fixed time or with a fixed volume, as we wouldn't know what is the apparatus that they're using or is not shown in the diagram. Therefore, you're not expected to know the amount or the volume to prepare. After you're done with this, we are going to talk about reliability. How do we ensure that the experiment is reliable? So we know that we are supposed to repeat the experiment. Experiment is repeated 3 times and take the mean. And one precaution here is to ensure the reliability, we make sure that every time we want to carry out a new experiment, we will actually open the tab and to allow the liquid to equalize and then close it again to take another measurement. It's like describing how do you reset the apparatus. So you can suggest by reopening the tab or using a syringe to allow the liquid to equalize. So this is how your dye will be returned to set point and you're ready to take another measurement. And for this planning, you have to mention that you're going to repeat step 1 to step 10 for every temperature. So you make sure that in total, you are actually preparing 5 different temperature. And finally, we can conclude the planning by mentioning about the safety and hazards. So for bio, usually for this planning, we will either mention it's either a low risk or medium risk, since this experiment does not involve anything that is flammable or corrosive. So mark scheme actually accept either low or medium risk experiment. So we can conclude by saying that this is a low or medium risk experiment, but remember to mention about this hazard that is present and the safety precaution. So any chemicals, enzymes or solution that you're using, we can always mention that it's irritant or harmful irritant. And the final point, usually to be safe, we will mention about the control experiment. But since part A, we have already mentioned about that, so we wouldn't need to repeat again. As for dependent variable, any experiment that involves calculation where there's a formula, we can actually include the formula in the dependent variable, showing how to calculate the rate of respiration. But in this question, in part B later on, we're going to come across a question asking for how would you calculate the volume of oxygen absorbed by wood lice. So you realize that after you have mentioned, it's actually redundant. In general, this is how a planning procedure looks like, and usually it can be more because we will include how to prepare the independent variable, and we will include a control experiment and the formula to calculate independent variable if present. So if you have more doubts, do join me for group or private tuition to understand more on the skills and techniques on planning experiments, and the statistics part of paper 5. Thanks for watching.
That's all for today's video. If you're interested in more genuine sharing by other geniuses, please subscribe to our channel and don't forget to turn on the notification bell, ding dong. Also, if you're struggling with one or two past year questions and the mark scheme just doesn't seem to help, Genie has got you covered. Feel free to let us know what question it is by filling in the Google form linked in the description below. GenieUs Hub will get genius teachers to fulfill your request for the solution. Genie will see you next time. Bye-bye.